and to show that rather than this frankly unjustified positioning of science into Western science, therefore it's Pākehā, and Mātauranga Māori is therefore Māori and everything else and all that kind of thing, I think those kinds of massive oversimplifications and frankly unjustifiable characterizations that are just not helpful, don't help our people.
Welcome to the Shape of Dialogue. Today I'm joined by Dr. Charles Royal, who is a highly respected scholar of Mātauranga Māori and Indigenous philosophies. Welcome, Charles. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Now, we are going to talk about Mātauranga Māori and its relationship with science, and this is an ongoing conversation I'm having on the podcast about, the so-called controversy that was started by the letter written by the 7 professors called In Defence of Science. But to start, I think it would be really good to talk about, or for you to talk about, who you are, your background, what you do, and your sort of pathway to where you are now, and a bonus, if you want to start that off in Māori, that would be amazing.
Well, kia ora Michael, tēnā koe, kia ora tātou, e whakarongo nei ki nei kōrero, ka nui rā te mihi atu ki a tātou watoa, kia taunga manakitanga ki rungi a tātou watoa. Kia ora Michael, my name is Charles Royal, and I belong to the iwi of Marutuahu and Hauraki, and Ngāti Rauko of the south, and Ngāpuhi in the north. I was born here in Auckland, but when we were kids, we went to Wellington. My dad got a job at the old Department of Education and was an inspector of Māori and Island education. They had such things back in those days, an inspector of Māori and Island education. And so we went, as little kids, we went to Wellington, and I grew up in Wellington. My mum is Pākehā of English, French, and Scots descent. I get my name Charles from my French great-grandfather. And my dad's Māori, as I said, and we grew up in Wellington, pretty straightforward kind of middle class circumstances. We weren't wealthy and we weren't poor either. We were just what we thought was just kind of run-of-the-mill Kiwis, I guess, living in Silverstream in Upper Hutt. I went to St Patrick's College, Silverstream, and went on to Victoria University to study. My first love, first and foremost, I'm a musician, Michael. My first degree was in Bachelor of Music from Victoria University Music School, and composing. And I love composing, and I still compose, and I have continuously so. I just recently had another piece of mine performed by the Dunedin Symphony Orchestra for a Matariki concert, which was a wonderful gift. Thank you, DSO, for that opportunity. So first and foremost, I'm a musician. It was through, I went to study music at music school at the then, I think we call it the Department of Music back in those days at Victoria University. These are the days of David Farquhar was the professor, and Jack Boddy, and Ross Harris, and Alan Thomas, and I had a wonderful introduction to the world of music there, and met people like the American composer Lou Harrison, the Australian composer Peter Sculthorpe, and we went to NZSO concerts and the Asia Pacific Festival of 1984, and all sorts of wild, crazy theatre, and we did all sorts of things. I did some of Shakespeare's and all of that jazz, and had a wonderful time as an undergraduate music student, and absolutely loved it. And music and poetry is kind of my first real calling, or first real love. But it was during my time also at music school that I went through an identity crisis as a Māori person. I had rejected thoroughly being Māori in my teenage years. I was in an overwhelmingly Pākehā environment, and no one was racist there, no one was bad to me or anything, but I inferred from the environment that Māori wasn't necessarily a good thing because there was no presence of it there. It was, and I became increasingly uncomfortable to be Māori during my teenage years, and I resisted it. At precisely the same time as my father got heavily involved in Māori education and pro-Māori things, I was busily rejecting Māori things and wasn't really interested in being Māori. Anyway, bit of a long story. I went through an identity crisis during my time at music school, and after I finished music school, I decided to go and plunge myself into the world of my ancestors, my Māori ancestors, to learn the language and literature and history and all this kind of thing. And so I was fortunate that when time came for me to learn the language and to learn aspects of my culture and what I later came to understand was a thing called Mātauranga Māori, it was my great fortune that Te Wānanga Warokoi, our iwi College of Higher Learning, was in the process of being established, and my father was heavily involved in that, and that was during the 1980s. 1981 was when it was first established, and I started attending classes and hui of various kinds there in 1985 and so on. So those are kind of my early days of kind of coming into the Māori world, you might say, and learning the language and learning aspects of my culture. At that time, I wasn't at all thinking about erudite subjects like Mātauranga Māori and its relationship to science or things. I was just learning history and stories and songs and all this kind of stuff. I had a great time doing that. It was in the midst of that, however, without really knowing what the hell I was doing, I got invited to a series of Māori or tribal epistemology seminars that were run in the late 1980s and early 1990s by an uncle of mine called Whatarangi Winiata. He was the professor of accountancy at Victoria University at the time and was the founder of Te Wānanga Warokoi and Otaki. And this was my kind of first introduction formally to, you might say, the academic study of our cultural knowledge, of the knowledge of the Māori world. And we read papers by Anne Salmond, who wrote these lovely descriptions of various things, and we had presentations from various kaumātua from around the countryside, and at the time I was just a kid. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I didn't realise what a gift that really was, and I met some really splendid elders of the Māori world, very dignified, very deep thinking people in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and that was my first kind of introduction to the formal study of our knowledge, as the formal study of our knowledge. This was moving out of a preoccupation with Māori identity and language revitalisation and all that jazz, to moving to engaging with it critically and to kind of understand what the hell is it and what can you do with it and so on. And then I went on to, I became the what's called the kaihotu, or the convener of the Master of Mātauranga Māori at Te Wānanga Warokoi between 1995 and 2000. And it was in the context of that job particularly that I first began addressing the two key questions. What is Mātauranga Māori? And secondly, why do we care about it anyway? What's so important about it? What can it offer the world now? And so I've been on a bit of a journey for, 20, 30 years or something, wrestling with those two questions. And as a result of wrestling with what is Mātauranga Māori, you necessarily have to get into questions of epistemology and what do you regard knowledge to be, and how is knowledge created, and how do you know you've got some decent knowledge versus some other not so great knowledge and all that kind of stuff.
The age old question.
All these questions actually.
Can I just get you to define epistemology, because I'm actually shocked how many people don't know what that word means. Yeah. Most people I come across have never come across that word.
Michael, I have to stress, this is a good moment for me to stress, I'm not an epistemologist or a trained scientist or a philosopher or anything like that. I stumbled into all of this through for a series of pathways of trying to be positive in the Māori world, to try and create things of value and importance in the Māori world. And I got a job running a master's program in Mātauranga Māori. And I thought to myself, well, if I'm running a master's program in Mātauranga, I better know something about what the hell I mean by Mātauranga Māori, right? At that time, I knew about waiata or songs or karakia, prayers and incantations and whakapapa. I knew those things, but I didn't know what Mātauranga Māori, the words, or what it really meant and what it inferred and so on. So So briefly to answer your question, epistemology is the study of knowledge and the study of knowing, theories of knowledge, weighing up. There's a technical term, and I'm trying to remember it. I'm not a very good epistemologist, but weighing up truth. Assertion, veracity. That's right. That kind of thing. Weighing up. It's all to do with the theory of knowledge and the theory of knowing. Yeah.
Yeah. It's how do we know what we know, and how do we know what we know is worth knowing.
Worth knowing. Yeah.
Yeah. And which is in this era is actually a really fundamental thing, because it is getting, in a way, the more information there is out there, the more access there is, it's almost harder to work out what is worth knowing. I mean, just to go back a step, it's quite funny because I think we must be very similar age. I'm 57.
Me too.
And I'm also a musician, and I also studied music. So,
right.
And I'm sure, and I also went to, I think it was the 1984 Asia Pacific Festival in Wellington. Yeah,
right.
It was a very big turning point in my life.
Yeah.
So we were probably at the same concerts at the same time.
Yeah, very possibly.
And so we've sort of had quite similar journeys. And I'm also not a trained philosopher or thinker or anything. I'm a bit of an autodidact, but I don't think that that doesn't stop you from actually knowing about the stuff and talking about it.
Offering something anyway.
Offering something, whatever it is. Can I ask you, going back to identity, because I think identity is a very big thing in the culture at the moment. And I personally, it confuses me, to be totally honest, because in a way, to me, it's obviously very important, but it's peripheral in some sense. But I'm just interested, your genealogy, your whakapapa, is a combination of Maori and European, right? And why is it that? So you would view yourself as Maori?
Yes, I do. But I've in 2006 or something, Helen Clark, who was our Prime Minister at the time, invited me to speak at the Beehive regarding where we're going as New Zealand and all that kind of stuff. And one of the questions I posed was wondering whether the Māori Pākehā paradigm had passed its use-by date, and whether a new language of identity is required to speak to meaningfully the nuances and complexities of life that we have here. And I read the wonderful Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, who wrote a wonderful book called Orientalism, which is, his basic thesis is that the way the Islamic world, the Muslim world, is constructed through literature, through music, through painting and so on, is the European imagination of that place, not the actual Muslim Islamic world itself. And it's that European imagination of that place which then flows into the European relationship to the Islamic world, and influences absolutely everything from foreign policy to interreligious relationships and things like that. And one of the many marvelous, wonderful points he made was this thing called reductive formulae, where words like Islam or the West or Asia or something are these hopelessly inaccurate, massive schemes to account for hugely diverse communities. And I just applied the same question here. Is the word Māori capable now of addressing and speaking meaningfully to the people that we would label Māori today? But does it actually speak meaningfully to their experience of it? And I struck a version of it when the very first time I ever worked in government. in 2003 when I began to work for the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology, it came very readily apparent to me that the word Māori in government circles did not mean the same thing as what I thought Māori meant from the circles that I had come from, namely Te Wāna Warauku and Otaki. And it was very similar, smaller in scale, of course, and maybe not so, dramatic, but it was very similar to what Edward Said was saying with respect to this grand thing called Islam in the West and so on. So, just offer that about the questions of identity. Identity is a very, very complex thing, and it's very hard to describe what is going on in the internal world of an individual as they're having to wrestle with their identity questions. What was going on with me when I was going through my thing? One of the number one things that I really like, I've just actually recently wrote about this, is what I didn't like was people knew that I was Māori and therefore asked me, well, what was the meaning of this and that? And I was deeply ignorant of Māori things, and I hated being put on the spot like that. I really, really, really hated it. And so I would try and avoid situations like that. I also, unfairly associated Māori things with things that were negative or things that weren't great or that kind of. I did that, even though my father was so much involved in so much positive Māori stuff. In my little teenage world, I had thought that no, Māori stuff was not great. I don't want anything to do with it, but in the end that was going to fall away because it's exhausting trying to be something that you're not, or trying to avoid something that you're not. I was always going to run out of steam and eventually have to turn to embrace, or turn to at least address and face this aspect of who I am that I hadn't before, and I'm pleased I did, because I've been on a wild adventure ride ever since, and uphill, down dale, all over the place. It's taken me all over the world and all that kind of stuff. So it's a hard, very, very nuanced, complex thing, identity, and
yeah. Just going back to Edward Said and what he's saying, I think there's a lot of value in that. It's the problem of thinking in categorical thinking, and it's broad brushstroke, making blanket statements. That's in a way that's the source of all prejudice is thinking in broad brushstrokes like that. But just a comment about that, the inverse applies. So Islam will have a broad brushstroke, categorical assessment of European culture,
and Pākehā.
And Maori and Pākehā, and that's why I although I appreciate identity is important, all that sort of thing, I don't hold sort of. It's hard to say this without sort of, putting my foot in my mouth. But I think there are more important things of our common humanity. That's how I look at it. Our common humanity is the overarching identity that we all have, and that's what concerns me about the conversation, sort of the primacy of identity, which is what a previous guest of mine called it, Dr. Eric Smith, and it's I'm what's also similar about me and you is not only your background, but I'm half Jewish, which is in a way it's a bit like being half Māori. I'm half English, from the British Isles, and half Jewish. So I have that Jewish component as well. And in a sense, if I'm honest, it's I really value that spice that it gives my, or who I am, or that window into a world. And I suppose that's what identity is about. It's giving you a window into a specific culture, which you can either take or leave as you so desire. And what you've done is pick that baton up and run with it, which is
well, I think so.
Led you where you are.
I think that's right, Michael. I mean, that's certainly the case with me. Was that my identity, embracing my identity, then opened a whole series of doors for me into a whole realm of thinking and experiencing and so on, which I know can help enrich life for all of us in New Zealand. I share that view with you. I'm a and person. I mean, I share that. Yeah. Share that common humanity. I absolutely fundamentally agree with you on our common humanity, which has some flavours in it, and has some has some dimensions with it. You know, I absolutely agree with it. We're all living in these beautiful little islands we call Aotearoa, New Zealand, whatever. We all regard these as home. We're all living in these places. We've got to figure out together how to build the best possible world we possibly can. And, you know, given our respective traditions and interests and experiences and all that kind of stuff, is how to bring them into positive relationship with one another to build a world that's best for everybody. Yeah.
And many of us, I say this in a positive light, many of us are mongrels, include myself, obviously. We're mixed ethnicities.
Yeah. Mixed grill is the expression that I've been using. Mixed grill is the expression.
Yeah. Long may it continue. Okay, one of the first questions I've got for you is, what is your vision for New Zealand?
Well, I probably share a vision in some respects. It's just the same as everybody else. I want an Aotearoa New Zealand that's wonderful place for our families, and where people can find, we live in loving home environments, and that there is good relationships between people, where people's potential and as their creative potential can have a chance of expression in the world, where things do go wrong, as they inevitably do in human situations. We've got the maturity to address them and find ways to heal and to move through. And a host of, good health, education, loving families, a healthy environment, that we're better at we get progressively better at living in positive relationship with the natural world, and getting over the excesses of the exploitation that we've been in, and so on. So all of those kinds of things I've very much share with everybody. I think everybody wants that. Everybody wants their place in the sun for their children, for their grandchildren, to feel positive about life. They can realise their potential, got the maturity to deal with problems when they arise inevitably, and so on. So that I share that with everybody, in that respect. And then we have a pretty successful democracy here in New Zealand, and we ought to value that. I certainly don't advocate not being a democracy. We ought to be a democracy of a kind, but I think like anything, like any country, it needs work, it needs help. What can we do about improving this democracy that we've got? And there's lots of things to say about that, but all of those kinds of things I share with everybody else. What I would add into the mix is a fundamentally reworked Indigenous dimension to the country, to make positive contributions to health and well-being, to education, to democracy itself, to political representation, to decision-making, and all this kind of stuff. So I'm certainly not advocating for some kind of radically different agenda for the future of New Zealand. I think we have a democracy in place of which we can all be proud. It's got its failings, and it certainly has had its failings in the past. But I certainly don't propose for that to be fundamentally changed in that regard, but rather improved, that we actually become really, really great as a country at refining and improving the democratic model in our kind of country, or our size of country. Of course, there are things that happens in larger countries that perhaps we don't quite have. I'm thinking about the United States as a democracy. It's a very different kind of democracy to New Zealand's democracy.
It's a republic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But anyway, the key thing is I think I'd like us to be really fantastic at improving it and growing, because it does have some faults, and I have some thoughts in this regard, and. But yeah, that's my that's my general vision going forward. It's general health and well-being for everybody and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
But from listening to you in previous videos and your writings, it's very much you said you like to use the word "and." It's a process that is more joining people together than separating people as we go forward. Yeah. Okay, I think we should define a few things. First of all, what is Mātauranga and then if you can also define indigenous or indigeneity.
Yeah, what that is, So, first and foremost, Mātauranga Māori are modern terms. They're not traditional terms. They're terms that became very popular from the 1980s onwards. And there's some reasons why.
So very modern.
They're very modern. And I know this for a fact because I went off looking for usages of the term in literature and also, and I searched far and wide to find usages of the words Mātauranga Māori before 1980. And I found two, and I can talk about that, and there may be one or two others, but it's pretty much after 1980 that the terms Mātauranga Māori became very popular, and they're just simply terms to refer to a body of knowledge that exists in New Zealand today. It doesn't tell you much about that body of knowledge. It just says there's a body of knowledge, and it's called Mātauranga Māori. And so that's the first thing I say, and the first and perhaps significant thing is that it's terms for a body of knowledge that exists in Aotearoa today. And the fact that it exists is actually quite remarkable because it did go through the experience of colonisation where parts were deliberately destroyed, other parts were left to history, and some other parts managed to make their way all the way through. Notably Te Reo Māori, that's what's really important. Te Reo Māori, although still endangered, does still exist today, and if we lost Te Reo Māori, it would be an enormous calamity to Mātauranga Māori and to the nation overall. So first of all, it's just simply a body of knowledge that exists in Aotearoa today. And the second point I make about it is fragmented and incomplete and disorganised. It's not a pristine, intact body of knowledge that survived beautifully through the generations. It isn't. It's fragmented and disorganised and incomplete. And there's some parts of it that are better organised and better known than other parts of Mātauranga Māori. So, for example, our knowledge around things like oratory, our traditional oratory, is in a better condition than, say, our knowledge pertaining to our traditional perfumes. We had a perfume tradition. We've got lots and lots of records of that. But our knowledge about how to make the perfumes and how you would do it, we don't know too much about that. So those are simple examples I use. So when it comes to marae oratory, we've got a lot more knowledge and experience, and it's better organised than, say, something like our traditional perfumes, and lots of other things that go with that, lots of other things as well. So the second thing I say about Mātauranga Māori, about this body of knowledge, is that it's fragmented and incomplete today. And some parts are better organised than in other parts. And a third thing I say is that Mātauranga Māori exists in a lot of different places, or sites, you might say. First and foremost, in the hearts and minds of Māori people, right? It's a body of knowledge system. Not all Māori people, plenty of Māori people don't know anything at all about Mātauranga Māori, Yeah. But, there are some Māori people that know. And there are also some who aren't Māori that know about Mātauranga Māori too. So the late Richard Nuns, for example, the Taonga Puoro musician, knew as much as anybody about traditional Māori musical instruments. So, and there are a lot more examples than that. The next thing I like to say that it exists first and foremost in the minds and hearts of people. There's also what is not quite well known today and appreciated is the extensive literary tradition that exists now. That when literacy first arrived in Aotearoa, in the 1769 onwards and so on, in those early years, our people took to literacy with great enthusiasm. And there was a massive outpouring of traditions and stories and analyses and arguments and all sorts of things onto the written form.
Just on that, because I find that quite fascinating. So when did you say that literacy when the Maori took up literacy?
After 1769, after Cook arrived, when
right,
during the years of the missionaries and so on.
Is there knowledge of like the rate of adoption, like in 50 years with 50% literate, or do you know that?
I don't know for sure. Do you mean, is there any data about the uptake of literacy in those years?
Yeah. What was it? Just the sort of the nobles, the chiefs and the like, or was it actually across the board?
I think I do recall that. I would need to check this, but I think in Michael King's History of New Zealand, there's some initial data about Māori kids going to the native schools, because this is where they learnt literacy, right? They went to the native schools, the missionary schools, and there was some data keeping right from the word go by the Church Missionary Society and by the Anglican Church particularly, of the number of children who were going to school at that particular place and this particular place and so on. That could be a proxy for literacy update, although it's a bit, bit questionable, but it's likely most of those kids who went to those schools emerged literate at that time, 1810, 1820, 1830, all of that kind of thing. But the key point that I make is that there was an enormous outpouring of knowledge into the written form, and so that's a second really important source of Mātauranga Māori today, is in the public and private collections of manuscripts by authorities of the 19th century, 20th century, and so on. The George Gray collection at the Auckland Library is a great example of that. It's a massive collection of stories and traditions and so on and so forth, and information about the maramataka, for example, or when to go into the forest and get what bird for what reason, and how to do this and how to do that and so on. There's a massive outpouring. So that's the second critical source of Mātauranga Māori today that I do a lot of work on. I describe that as one of the great untapped resources of knowledge available to this country. That's not really understood of the significance of all of that, So that's the second thing. And a third source of Mātauranga Māori today are all those kinds of expressions of Mātauranga Māori that you find around the place, like researching into artefacts, for example, are a great way of uncovering ideas and concepts and so on in Mātauranga Māori. So what I'm sketching for you is, where is Mātauranga Māori today, right? And the first one is in people, the second one is in the literature tradition, the third one is in the tangible expressions of culture, such as artefacts and things like that. The fourth one is the institutions and organisations where Mātauranga Māori is being used, which you could argue is people, of course, but Kohanga Reo through to Whare Wānanga, for example, are places where Mātauranga Māori is being utilised in significant ways and so on. So first of all, it's a body of knowledge that exists, and that's remarkable in itself. Secondly, it is fragmented, incomplete, and disorganised. Some parts are better organised than others. And consequently, it's in a state of recovery now. It's not in a state of perpetuation. In some respects, it might be, but it's in a state of recovery. Thirdly, where you can find Mātauranga Māori is in people, literature, cultural expressions, organisations, and so on. So that's kind of like the first way to answer the question, what is Mātauranga Māori? And that's more of a kind of, that's kind of like 101, right? About what, right?
But essentially, I mean, this is a question, but essentially it's knowledge of the pre-European Māori culture. Yes or no?
Well, this is things get a little bit difficult here. So first and foremost, pre-European Māori culture, yes. And
essentially their cultural artefacts and their technological artefacts or methodologies.
Yes.
So a combination of two.
Yes.
So you can have a waiata or a song, or but then you can have a fishhook.
Fishhook, or knowledge how to construct a house,
and how to construct a house, or as you said, to go and find a particular berry and prepare a berry or whatever.
Yeah. What plants to to harvest in the forest and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it's very definitely pre-European knowledge, but it's also the influence of that knowledge in the post-European time, because our people also created further knowledge on that basis through the experiences of colonisation. So our people created new knowledge through, particularly in the period from 1769 to 1840, even up to 1860, 1870. There was lots of cultural creativity going on, even though it might have been really created in conflicted circumstances, but lots of cultural creativity, the adoption of things from the European, making use of that into new cultural expressions and things like that. And then also some of the ingenious responses to warfare. It's said, for example, that trench warfare was invented, in New Zealand. I don't know exactly whether that's true.
Well, that's James.
Yeah, Jamie Ballard says that. That's cool. I mean, Jamie's a professor. He's pretty knowledgeable.
It's a nice idea. But
the thing is, without knowledge of trench warfare from anybody else, they came up with it, right? They came up with it in their circumstance.
That's the gate power.
Gate power, Lua Pika in the north. And a number of different places.
And just in broad brushstrokes, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but just for our listeners and our international listeners, Gate Power was a complete rout of the British, wasn't it? And where it was not only trench warfare, but stealth warfare.
And it was to a standstill. It was a bit of a what do you call it? They fought to a standstill. Really, it was a.
What do you mean by that?
What is the word? I completely forgot my word. I'm forgetting my English.
Say it in Maori.
It wasn't super conclusive on either side.
On either side.
It was
a hiatus. But it's still not the right. I know.
So our people were creating knowledge all the way through. Right? It was all the way through to these things, but pressure came upon our people. After that period, it was the period from about 1870 through to 1930, 1940, where there was a real decline in the knowledge of our people,
right.
and our people had moved from creatively responding to life to turning inwardly and holding on to things, right, and protecting themselves.
Was that period the migration from rural life to city life?
No, that's much later again. It's much later again. Okay. Although there's some of that as well. There's some of that. But in this period, our people were still living largely in tribal communities. This is the time of Parihaka, for example, and Taranaki, leading up to the big Ratana movements. This is the Kotahitanga parliaments of the 1890s and things like that, where the Māori world was said to be on its lowest ebb. This is the time of Smooth the Pillow of the Dying Race, all of that racist stuff.
And also the biggest, as I understand it, the biggest killer of indigenous populations was germs.
That's right. Yeah. It was when apparently there was, if I remember correctly, there was some estimate of 42,000 Māori left in the world, and it was the lowest ebb of the Māori world. So naturally, all the energy of the Māori world wasn't towards creativity; it was towards protection. It was also in that time, however, that emerged one of the greatest modern Māori leaders of the time, being Apirana Ngata. And his career was approximately 1900 to about 1950. That was his period, and he lived through that whole period of really shoring up, you might say, and protecting the reserves of the Māori world. His great collection of songs called Ngā Moteatea was this massive project to preserve traditional Māori songs, which was an enormous project of which today we still benefit from. It's an amazing collection, but it's very much of that time. It's the time of recording and collecting and preserving and so on. This is the time of Elston Best. This is the time of George Graham here in Auckland. This is the time of Anne Salmon's ancestor, James MacDonald, going down the Whanganui River and photographing people and so on. So it's very much the time of the protection of things and preserving things. And then you have, following the Second World War, the new rapid urbanisation into Auckland and Wellington and stuff like that, which resulted in another decline in Māori knowledge and Māori language speaking and cultural life and things like that, which then, of course, gave rise to the modern Maori Renaissance. So there's lots to say about all of that. So Mātauranga Māori changed very significantly through all of that, but it had to. It was just naturally it would change through all of those experiences from that pre-European time to a first period of real growth and change, because they adopted literacy, they adopted the new worldview, they adopted technology, they did all sorts of different things to transform and change, just like any cultures around the world have come into contact with one another. All sorts of change and happen, but then you go into these two significant periods of decline. And out the other end, we've got where we are today, which is the Maori Renaissance starting approximately the early 1970s and into the 1980s, of which I'm a product of, and so on.
So where are we today then?
The way I describe it is, I think we in the Maori community, I think we are making the transition from a preoccupation with healing the past to slowly transitioning into, okay, well, now that we've done that, what is the world that we've got and how are we going to cope with it and so on, and what do we do about it? Some parts of the Māori community are much further down that track than other parts of the Māori community. My own iwi, for example, that I belong to, we haven't even resolved our treaty claims. We're a long way off. My people of Ngāti Raukawa in the south are only going through the Waitangi Tribunal now. They're the last significant iwi to go through the tribunal. So in one way you could say Ngāti Raukawa is a long way behind resolving the past. But it's also important to remember that Ngāti Raukawa was also the iwi that established the very first whare wānanga in 1981. And so it's not simply a case of finish that treaty claim and now we can address the future. It's not quite as simple as that. But the key thing is, I think where Māori communities are at now is that it is, that once you settle a claim, like Waikato has happened, what's happened with Waikato, what's happened with Ngāti Whātua, what's happened with Ngaitahu is, okay, we've got all that settled now. Now what next? What do we do, right? What do we do? And so, I actually, a large part of my audience is actually from overseas. So just explain what the settlement process is briefly. Right. So in 1840, representatives of the Queen of England, the Crown, signed a treaty with a whole range of Māori tribes here in New Zealand. And it was signed over an 8-year period. It wasn't signed in one day on February the 6th, 1840. That was the first day. But the treaty was signed over an 8-year period, and it was taken to everywhere in the country. It was signed as far south as Ruapuke Island, which is a little island in Fovo Strait, right at the very bottom of New Zealand. It was signed there. And at many points all the way through New Zealand and so on. And most tribes, there are a notable number of exceptions, but most tribes signed the treaty, and so today it's regarded that everybody signed and everybody participates in the treaty. Now, unfortunately, what happened with the colonisation of New Zealand, the British Crown then went off and promptly breached the treaty in many ways, and many
as you do,
in many ways, and many heinous ways, invasion of people's homes and invasion of people's lands and removing them, burning them, and killing people, and all this kind of stuff. This all happened under the British Crown. So naturally, it was going to happen at some point that New Zealand had to turn to address all of that. You can't bring that amount of damage to a whole group of people and not have to account for it somehow at some point, at some time.
It's truth and reconciliation.
Precisely.
My question is it possible to, in your opinion, to reconcile those grievances?
In my view, you have to. I don't think we've got any option to. I can fully appreciate and I can fully understand why some Māori are very very wary to come into any kind of relationship with the Crown. because of what happened. It was, some of the things were really, really awful. And my own village was bombed by the HMS Miranda, and people were killed in that part, but having said that, nonetheless, I still believe that we've got no option as a country but to confront them and resolve them and get through. Otherwise, they will just continue to be a stain upon the soul of the nation. They'll continue to bedevil us as a nation.
Yeah, well, I mean, even on a personal level, living in the past is never a good thing.
But it's difficult for some not to be able to do that, though, Michael. Some people are in really difficult circumstances. It's not easy.
It's not easy. No, not diminishing it at all. And that's why I asked, because again, I'm definitely no expert on in this field. But I imagine that the recompense is actually relatively small to the loss.
1.5%.
Yeah, so it's the definition of marginal.
It is very, 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 very minimal indeed. Yeah. Even that is not well known by New Zealanders. There are a lot of New Zealanders who believe that this Māori elites are running away with the wealth of the nation.
You hear, in terms of billions of dollars, which is a lot. But if $1 billion is 1%, it's not much.
And divide that $1 billion amongst 72 tribes.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, even that figure is contestable as well, of course. Yeah. Debatable. So no. I mean, the monetary side of things is actually not the real reason. The value.
Well, you mean the important thing. The value thing is is essentially, as I say, is restoring mana.
Absolutely, it's absolutely. I think it's to do with restoring the mana of the crown, and
right of both parties.
Absolutely,
right.
Restoring the mana of the
and
crown.
And just for international listeners, mana means respect.
The authority, the prestige, the integrity. And restoring the mana of the crown in the eyes of Māori is really critically important, and also creating real opportunity, I think, for Māori to. Oh dear, sorry.
All right.
Oh, are we going? Oh, sorry, my computer was playing up then for a second. And what I think is really important is to be able to, first of all, just speak about the hurts that happened, to talk them, get them out into the air and just basically talk about them. Secondly, find some compensation for that where it's possible. On many occasions, it's simply not possible. It's just simply not possible. Where possible, find that. Thirdly, look for opportunities to do something together, where there might be something, maybe we can't recompense on that thing, but maybe we could do something over here, an acknowledgement of these things. I mean, that's what I think is going on. With them.
You're hopeful that in whatever time period, whether it's 10 or 50 years, that we'll actually get to a place where, as a country, we can move on as one without endless grievance.
Well, most definitely.
In a sense, on multiple sides, because as you mentioned, there may be misapprehensions on non-Māori that you can almost imagine a scenario where non-Māori or certain sectors of non-Māori feel grieved that so-called billions of dollars are being divvied out.
Well, the important thing is to remember, Michael, there hasn't been billions of dollars. That's absolutely
no.
Let's make sure
I'm not saying that's what I think. I'm just saying that.
But it's important not to perpetuate that misunderstanding. People think that the government is handing over billions of dollars to Māori. That is simply untrue. That's just simply not the case. And that.
So going back to my question, on both sides, do you think we can get to a point, say in 100 years' time, where this is history, and we're moving on this little island together as one.
Well, certainly. It's not going to happen suddenly overnight. A lot of the Māori community are already there, Michael. They're already into how do we build a nation together. They're already there.
Yeah.
There are some that aren't. They're in other places and, still concerned about grievance and so on. My personal aspiration is I hope that we can genuinely resolve the grievances of the past so we can get on to the proper business of the treaty.
Which is?
In my view, the treaty was never designed to be an instrument for the alleviation of grievance. Why?
Right.
It was never designed to be that. I mean, why would my ancestors sign a treaty with a group of people they knew were going to bring a thing called colonisation to them?
Sorry, say that again. They knew
what I mean by that is I think why they would sign the treaty was to confirm their own sets of rights and position in the country, right? And not as, this is a prenup agreement because we know we're going to get into problems with one another. And we're going to,
when we're divorced,
and all this kind of thing. And one day we're going to need a thing called the Waitangi Tribunal. I don't think they could ever foresee that was going to happen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So my view, I think the Treaty of Waitangi was never designed to be an instrument for the alleviation of grievance, but rather was, from a Māori point of view, a document to confirm their own rights and position in the nation. And they just believed that this was going to continue. And for the Crown of England was going to introduce some arrangements whereby their affairs were going to be handled with better administration than what they had seen in the last 20 years when it was Wild West in the north at places like Russell and stuff like that.
Yes, yeah. Just explain that to the audience. As I understand it, was quite lawless, but the Europeans, and they were included, Americans as well.
Americans
and French,
yes,
possibly. I can't remember.
French.
But it wasn't just the English, and it was like the Wild West.
It was like the Wild West. They didn't. I'm convinced our ancestors didn't sign the Treaty of Waitangi believing that this was going to be the doorway by which they will have least political power in the country. Unless
whoever signs away,
who would do that? I mean, it's just stupid.
Yeah.
To think that they would do that.
That I mean, we just sort of keep on going down this tangent, but at the beginning of this year, I read half of the Musket Wars. Do you know that book?
Who's the author?
Ron Crosby.
I flicked through bits and pieces. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, it's a history of what are called the Musket Wars, which are the wars roughly between 1800 and 1840, between the intertribal wars between the Māori.
Yes.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I'm no expert, and I haven't triangulated to this book to work out. I haven't done my epistemological research on it. I'm taking it. It was recommended by someone I respect, so I'm taking it as accurate. And I've actually spoken to the author. I'm hoping to get him on, and it sounds like it's a legitimate book. But I had to actually stop reading it because it was so disturbing. I mean, in the book it says that more Māori were dislocated in the Musket Wars than in the wars between the British and the Maori, and what are called the land wars. I mean, I'm a bit of a softie, so I literally got to the point where I just couldn't. The brutality was just so extreme. So what I'm going to put to you is, was the Treaty of Waitangi sort of a sense like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan for the Māori, as a way of having a Leviathan to sort of to protect everyone, a universal policeman, to provide security for all and to get over the fighting? It was a bit like the Treaty of Westphalia in I think 15 something or other, can't remember, 1530 I think, after, I think, was it the 100 Years' War or the 30 Years' War in Europe, where they basically got to the point where they realised that maybe fighting endlessly wasn't a great thing. Is that, again, it's a question, it's not a statement. Is it an accurate reading or not?
Well, so here's a couple of thoughts. Okay, here's a couple of thoughts. If you take the case of Te Rauparaha, the great Ngāti Toa chief, he migrated.
I studied him when I was about 10, so I know has fond memories of him.
And in the period of about 1850 to around about 1840, he led his people on an enormous migration out of a place called Kāwhia on the western side of North Island, right down to the southern part of the North Island and across the Cook Strait region, basically the middle part of New Zealand, right? And he, led his people on and formed alliances, enormous battles and fight, mayhem and all this kind of thing, conflict and so on. My Ngāti ancestors were heavily involved in all of that, right? The point I make is that after 20 years of battling and building his empire in about Cook Strait, he certainly wasn't agreed to then hand over the sovereignty of all of that to the Queen of England by signing the treaty in 1840, as he did on Mutungangara Island, if I remember, which is the island of Kapiti. So the first thing, this notion that people like Te Rauparaha and signing the treaty were handing over sovereignty to all of their environs and so on, their kingdoms and so on, to the King and Queen of England, which some people assert that's what he was doing, is just preposterous to think that that's what he was doing. The second thing is, however, and he understood himself that he had led his people through an enormous journey of conflict and dissent and some of the awful experiences that happened in those times, including his own children got murdered and all this kind of stuff, He himself understood that this needed to come to an end. And it needed to come to an end. And so a part of the motivation, it is argued, that some of these chiefs did sign the treaty was to accept Christianity, to bring or to allow missionaries to undertake their business in their areas and their missionaries to grow in their activities and so on. So one of the things that happened around the signing of the treaty in the north was the release of a lot of prisoners from the north. Once the treaty was signed, it was an agreement to release prisoners from intertribal Māori prisoners from the intertribal warfare previous to 1840.
Oh, I see. I mean, sort of almost intertribal prisoners.
Intertribal prisoners, yeah.
Yes. So not prisoners by the British.
No. Sorry. I mean, prisoners, intertribal prisoners from the warfare before 1840. They were released, and I have some on my Hauraki side of my family. I descend from a man who was released from imprisonment in amongst Ngāpuhi in the north. Of that time and so on. So part of the motivation, it is argued, for signing the Treaty of Waitangi was to permit the rise of Christianity in these communities as a way of overcoming these interminable conflicts that had happened between our people.
That's really, that's really interesting. The reason being, because...
Well, they understood that. I think they understood. Certainly, people like Te Rauparaha is probably the example I know best. He understood that he was in the process of establishing this kingdom for his people. He was also committing them to a future that was much like the path that he himself had walked. And I think he understood that. This is why when he in 1847 he was imprisoned without reason for 18 months by Governor Grey in an attempt to break his wairua, to break his mana, as it were, to break his spirit and his authority. And when he returned home, he called for the establishment of Rangiatea Church in Otaki. This is in 1847 or 1846 or thereabouts. And he himself called for the establishment of Rangiatea Church, which was to be the new way out of the intertribal conflict and into a new peace you might say, amongst all these different peoples and so on. So that's very... There's also argued there's an Article 4 in the Treaty of Waitangi, never got put there, but Article 4 of the treaty, which was about religious freedom and about the permitting the churches to go about doing their thing. And also remembering they were Church of England missionaries who wrote the treaty, remember, who translated the treaty, and took Henry Williams and co, who took it around New Zealand and so on. So that's a big dimension of the treaty, is the degree to which the treaty enabled the growth of Christianity in Māori communities here.
It always fascinates me how Indigenous cultures, it's not uncommon for in the colonial period, how Indigenous cultures essentially change religions. So, I mean, you think how strong Christianity is in the Polynesian islands.
Yeah.
And, I mean, you've touched on it there, but did they actually think it was a better philosophical framework for them, or were they duped into it? Great marketing, or you know, why the change?
No, I've seen that expressed. A certain conscientised younger Māori today talking about how their ancestors were duped into Christianity. I find that a bit insulting, to tell you the truth. You know, certainly not. When Tarauparaha had his own son, Tāmihana Tarauparaha, and a nephew called Martin de Fifi, the two of them left the southern reaches of the North Island and travelled all the way to Waitangi to petition for a missionary to be installed in the new township of Otaki. And this was to be associated with Rangiatea Church. And they initially wanted Henry Williams, who was the star of the show at the time amongst the missionary community. But they eventually got Octavius Hadfield, who turned out to be a really great missionary for that part of the country. And he became heavily involved in the establishment of Rangiatea Church and the early churches and so on. Now, I think Martin de Fifi and Tāmihana Tarauparaha going to Waitangi wasn't the case of dull natives falling under the spell of Christianity because they're, you know, the Christians are so lovely and wonderful and all that kind of thing. No, I think that they could see that it provided for them a deeply and profound spiritual rationale, if you can use that expression, for getting out of their present problems, difficulties. Remember that they were in a culture that if you said even a mildly insulting thing to somebody else, boom, you know, depending on who it was, of course, but boom, you're into conflict immediately. And then
it's a mark of an honour culture.
Yes.
When you don't have when you don't have a Leviathan like the state or enforcement by police, you actually have to enforce the law yourself. And so you become, it's the game theory is that you have a hair trigger. So if someone So the cost of insulting you is going to be high. Yeah. So it's less likely.
Also remember, just another thing really important is the traditional Māori view of physical death is not the same in traditional Māori culture, the physical death of the person is not the calamity, it's the loss of mana.
So you can actually be alive but dead at the same
time. Exactly. And I've got another ancestor who said, far be it for me to die in honour on the battlefield than to die of old age at home, of infirmities at home.
It's that line, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees.
Absolutely. It's
sort of similar thing.
If you are insulted and you didn't rise to the challenge of that and respond to that.
Yeah.
That was the loss of mana. You may eventually end up getting killed, but it didn't matter. You responded.
Yeah.
So it's the key thing is that it's really important to remember that the death of the physical body is not the calamity in traditional Māori life. Traditional Māori view. It's the loss of mana that is the calamity.
Yeah. I mean, it actually reminds me of the Spartans.
Right.
They had the same approach.
Right.
Their mother, the mothers would say to the warriors, either come back with your shield or on your shield, something like that.
Right.
You know. So I mean that's what I. Again, going back to what we discussed about right at the beginning of our conversation about our shared humanity, here we are discussing, you're telling me something I didn't know about Māori culture, and I'm relating it to the Spartans 2,500 years ago.
Right.
So the key thing is that humans, they often come up with the same ideas. Yeah, in similar circumstances.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean that was just an aside, in the Musket Wars. There was a story about Utu where someone was offended. It was a pretty grievous offence. Someone had killed someone or whatever. I can't remember what it was, but the length that this individual took to what do you call rectify the Utu was quite extreme. He got on a European boat, waited for the other chief to come out onto the boat, and under the nose to that poor old chief, he was summarily murdered. Murdered. Shot dead, and that was it. And there was no retribution. Well, there's no court to determine there was no murder or anything like that. It was just that was the rule of the day.
But also the thing to remember, and again I'm not trying to diminish this, but the way they're written in history books and things like that, it seems like this was a daily occurrence that this happened.
Well, that's all history. It's all history.
It's all history. Somebody goes, oh my God, every day they're out there battling one. Well, no, not really. Lots and lots of years pass between these various incidents.
Yeah, I mean, well, as I said, the Musket Wars were over,
40 years.
Roughly 40 years. And again, going back to the European wars, the 100 Years' Wars, it wouldn't have been 100 years of endless 24/7, 365 days.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's indigenous? What's indigeneity?
Right. Well, the way I define indigeneity is kinship-based relationships with natural world environments. So what is meant by that is that if you look into traditional Māori knowledge, there's this constant yearning for relationship to specific geographies and specific places. A typical example of this is that when someone asks you, or if you were compelled to identify who you were, you identified yourself through reference to a mountain, to a river, to a waterway, to a particular geography, right? And this is a very, very typical feature of what I call formal Indigenous cultures around the world, this constant ritualizing and connecting to specific places. And it's the theme that reflects through things like burying the placenta of newborn children in specific places, eating the food of particular gardens. So you take it into your body, and the physical material of your body is being transformed into the physical material of that particular place. The donning of cloaks and so on to transform yourself into a bird. The naming of mountain and landscape features after parts of the body or sacred ancestors and all that. They're all to do with this relationship, a kinship-based relationship with natural world environments, and that I believe is the primary principle or founding feature or whatever of what I call formal Indigenous cultures. And what I mean by formal Indigenous cultures are your typical cultures we refer to as being Indigenous. The First Nations peoples of North America, for example, Aboriginal people and so on. Find it was parts of Europe and other places as well, this idea of a kinship relationship with natural world environments. So that's the first and defining feature of what I call indigeneity, or what in Māori we call tangata whenua, this people land. It's the same idea. People of
the land, literally.
People equivalent to land, and land equivalent to people. Right. One and the same thing. I mean, it's that my humanity is experienced and revealed and explained to me through my relationship to specific geographies, specific places, forests, mountains, and things like that. Now, I also argue that everybody has the seeds of indigeneity in them. It's a part of being human to be in correspondence with the environment in which you grow up in. And so, if you grew up in on the 6th floor of a high-rise building in a Hong Kong apartment building, you're naturally going to be native to that. That's the environment you grow up in. It's natural to be in correspondence. Even the physiology of your body is affected by the environment in which you grow up in that. But what distinguishes formal Indigenous cultures, however, is the idea of making a great point about, I am related to this place is me, I am the river is me, and things like that, and ritualizing it continually, which is something that goes on continually and so on. So that discussion is the first part of indigeneity that I talk about, and the other part of indigeneity I talk about is all the lessons and experience and wisdom gained through the experience of colonisation. That Indigenous peoples today do have views and thoughts and perspectives on ideas like peace and conflict and justice and reconciliation and things like this as a result of the experiences of colonisation as well. And, the Waitangi Tribunal is full of material of this kind, of reflections on the part of Indigenous people here in New Zealand, reflecting on the experience of colonisation. So those are the two aspects I discussed today about indigeneity: the kinship-based relationships with natural world environments, and the other aspect is the lessons, wisdoms, perspectives gained through the experience of colonisation.
Right. You, in one of your talks, you talked about, I think the terminology was Indigenous-inspired democracy.
Yeah.
Do you want to expand on that?
That's my comm speak, marketing speak.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do there is try to offer some kind of positive vision regarding the relationship between the so-called Western tradition we've got, largely European-derived, that comes into New Zealand through the treaty, and so on, and the Indigenous tradition who's is present in the country and whose foundations are to be found in the Old Pacific and Ancient Pacific and so on. So what I have in my mind is this European-derived Western tradition coming into the country and coming into positive relationship with the Pacific Indigenous tradition, and how we can bring these two things into positive relationship with one another to produce a nation that we can all love and be proud of and benefit from and so on. So that's what I mean by...
So do you mean in a constitutional context?
I don't know yet. I think it probably will be. But let me just give you a little bit of an illustration of where I came across this idea. What got me thinking along these lines is that. So I just finished a 2-year research project in the north about the Wairua River, where the task was to go and talk to tribal communities along the Wairua River regarding their view of the river and their view of what's happened to the river. The river is in a disgraceful state. I think it's a national shame what has happened to that river. It's just in a dreadful state. And there are all sorts of efforts and initiatives now to try and fix the river and so on. And I was asked to lead a research project which was about understanding what those tribal communities along the river think about the river now. What do they think about what has happened to the river, and what do they think needs to happen going forward? So that got us into all sorts of conversations about all sorts of things: their traditional view of the river, how they traditionally used it, what resources they harvested, and what ceremonies and rituals were conducted, all of these kinds of things. But what emerged out of all our discussions when we got to, well, where to next? Okay, that's great, but how do we fix this river? Where do we go next? One of the things that became apparent to me was that they never once said the Crown doesn't have a right to implement its management structures as they pertain to the river, because that's derived from the treaty. It comes from the Crown. Sorry, it comes from the treaty. The Crown gets a right to implement government in this country, and the government, it comes in the form of local government that affects the management of the river. None of these communities ever said they don't have a right to do it. They're not particularly happy with local government, and they think local government has done a terrible job of looking after them, but they never fundamentally said they don't have a right to do something in this space, right? All they're looking for is some on-the-ground agency and decision-making authority to develop some on-the-ground, ground-up grassroots initiatives to help improve the river, to sit alongside that of the Crown, and to come into positive relationship with one another for the purposes of improving the river. Their discussions weren't at all about, we need a Māori parliament, or we need a new Māori voting system, or we need an upper legislature, or all of that kind of stuff. None of it was about that at all. It was, how can we achieve decision-making authority, not all, but some decision-making authority, to do with our particular part of the river. And how...
it's essentially, how do we make democracy more democratic, in a sense?
It could,
because and as I always say, the amazing thing about democracy is often it's not that democratic.
Right.
And it's, when I heard you talk about this, it made me think, in a sense, what you're asking for is a decentralisation of authority. That's right. From to a grassroots, a localised, whatever the word is, platform or scheme, rather than a top-down approach.
That's right. Well, a ground-up approach to supplement the top-down approach.
Yeah, so they're working in tandem.
Yeah, working in tandem. So when you conceive and think about that level, they need not necessarily be in competition with one another from the outset. Yeah. They might eventually be in competition, but from the outset, they're not necessarily in competition. And so it's that kind of thinking in my mind when I use coin that phrase, an indigenously inspired Western democracy. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's actually quite interesting, because what you're saying resonates with something that I've been involved in over the last 7 years, which is issues to do with the Auckland Waterfront. Right. And in a sense, it's exactly the same thing. The council, in their great wisdom, the Ports of Auckland, in their great wisdom, wanted to concrete over the Waitemata Harbour. And they still want to. And the council took quite a lot of persuading on our group's part and a number of other groups' part to halt that. So I think that's the perennial, part of that is the perennial balancing act between a top-down authority and grassroots democratic endeavours, essentially.
Well, something that might be a little bit different, however, Michael, is similar in that regard, but a little bit different is that I would charge those tangata whenua-led grassroots initiatives to be very much attempting to advance you might say, an indigenous way of being in the world, or indigenous relationship to those places. Right? Yeah. So a sense that, seeing yourself kin to the natural world and to these rivers and so on. And so it's not just, I've got the authority now and will do what they would do anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've got authority now to actually genuinely introduce some very different ideas into the mix of discussion about how we might interact with that.
It's not so much. Yeah, it's not so much the ideas in a general sense. You actually want the ideas that are going to make a positive effect.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
because we can all come up with ideas that don't work.
Yeah.
We're good at that. It's interesting. If I can speak frankly, the what you're talking about, the connection between sort of essentially humans and a kinship connection and land or nature, from a scientific point of view, there's two aspects. Yes, everything's all made out of the same thing. You know, famous quote from Richard Feynman, you know, famous 20th century physicist, was everything's made of atoms, right? So in one sense, we have a relationship in that we're all made of the same stuff. But that's on a micro level. On a macro level, you know, the science says that we're not the same thing. We're not the same as rocks and all that sort of thing. But nevertheless, I think, you know, what you touched on before, I think, you know, many, probably not all, but I'd say there's a growing trend that we value the environment much more than we used to. And we're less inclined to soil or muddy the environment, or destroy it, or diminish that's a better word, diminish the environment. And so I think in that sense it's maybe a different nomenclature mature, but essentially it's the same. You know, I think that attitude is similar across a lot of people.
Yeah, but it may not, also, Michael, may not need a scientific argument. It may be a cultural argument.
Well,
that wins the day.
Yeah, I mean that's you know. Yes, yeah. Well, I mean it's a value.
Yeah, value, exactly.
It comes down to values rather than. But I mean, and it's a value that is valuable. Meaning a valuable value.
Meaning that I adhere to this value not just because I'm Māori and I've got this value, but because it does produce good outcomes for people.
Yes.
And for the environment and that, you know, and
so maybe tell me if this is accurate. So essentially, because of your knowledge of Indigenous knowledge and philosophies, you can see things that would benefit us all, and that's what you want to add to the political dynamic.
Most definitely. I also think that when you speak to those who aren't Māori and who have been in a particular geography for a long time, you talk to some farmers and things like that, there is this growing sense of connection that they feel between that place and them themselves. There is this growing sense of defining themselves through that place. Right, so and so it's not. I see a lot of this as just common human stuff. That you know that if you and your family have lived in the valley for donkey's years, as many Pākehā families have now, it's you know it's there is this sense of growth of identity and deep identification with those places, and it's growing. They may not necessarily have the same poetry or the same language for it, but there's this growing sense of deep identification between people and the places and so on. So my I guess my key thing is to say that I think that we probably won't get to a better state with the environment and natural world unless we address the question of our relationship to it. If we just keep moving along on a bunch of givens about our relationship and then just try and fix things without actually addressing the relationship itself, I think this is the case. I might be wrong, Michael. I don't really know. I'm speculating here. I may not quite get to where we really want to, unless you really think about the relationship between people and these places. You know.
Yeah. Well, it's again valuing what we value, or working out what we value. And those are, in many respects, those are cultural. But I would actually say science plays a big part in that, in telling us what's wrong and where to go to next. Now, talking about science, can we talk about this whole thing that I've suddenly found myself in with talking to great people like you, accidentally stumbling into was started by when a friend of mine who actually lives in Slovenia, who's also a musician and also a composer, he sent me the In Defence of Science letter. And again, for anyone who hasn't read it or anything, all the stuff will be in the show notes, which was essentially saying, if I can characterise it correctly, Mātauranga Māori is important in many ways. They detailed them in the letter, but it falls short of what can be deemed science. They stated that there will be aspects of Mātauranga Māori that could contribute to the scientific canon, or another way of putting that, are worthy for investigation. Now, the outcry, there was it was a very controversial letter, which I find interesting because I didn't find it controversial, and there was a big outcry, some quite extreme, some what I thought was quite ill-reasoned. What are your thoughts on it? Two things, I suppose. What are your thoughts on it, and then maybe we talk about, is Mātauranga Māori science, or certain aspects of it, scientific, or...
Yeah. So when I first read the letter, I was a bit taken aback by the letter too, and okay. I didn't like the fact that there were, I'm a 20-year experienced person in Mātauranga Māori, and people who weren't of a similar amount of time studying Mātauranga Māori professing to hold conclusive views about it. It wasn't that we think it's kind of like they're actually making firm statements about Mātauranga Māori, and it reminded me of a lot of cultural things that happen in New Zealand, where lots of people who the old chestnut every year, we get letters to the listener that go, people who do not speak Te Reo Māori but profess to state whether it's got any value or not. So they're not speakers of the Māori language, but constantly go on and say, well, it's got no value at all because I can't speak it in Paris, or something like that. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, but I can't speak French in Beijing either. So that means French has no value.
So
anyway.
My first response was I was a bit taken aback by these people who weren't experts in Mātauranga Māori and readily accepted it, but were professing to make kind of very conclusive statements what they thought about it. So they weren't about. So my taken abackness wasn't actually about what they said, but the fact that these were people who weren't experts in Mātauranga Māori professing to make statements about it. That was the first thing. The second thing is I found it unusual that it was in a listener letter and not in a conference paper or a journal article or a conventional avenue for airing questions of this kind, and wondered why was it in a listener. What were and all I can conclude is that they wanted their views known, and they wanted their dissatisfaction, I think, about things known, out in the world. So my immediate reaction was to be a bit taken aback by the letter, and I did sign the open letter that Sean Hendy and co wrote. So I decided, it was sent around as a,
Did you actually read it?
Yeah, no, I read it. Yeah, I read it. Yeah, I read it,
okay.
And I agreed with some of the sentiments, and I agreed with some of the sentiments in the listener letter as well. And but ultimately I was thinking about, if I wrote a letter to the listener to say that if is not Mātauranga Māori, it's got very limited, I think people would be taken aback that if I was to make some kind of statement about physics or macrobiology or something like that, people say, well, you're not an expert. How can you possibly make any conclusion and expect people to accept your view? You're not an expert in it. No. So that was my initial reaction. And then I saw all of these comments and all of these things, and I saw some comments that were really poorly thought through and thought about it, and I chose not to make comment, and I've deliberately not made comment until the middle of this year. I made, I did. The only exception was a little bit of comment I made in the seminar that you saw at the University of Auckland, and also in a letter that I subsequently published in a listener later the year, responding to Brian Boyd. Yes, and that kind of thing. Anyway, so I because it was getting really heated up, and because I was aware of my own position with respect to Mātauranga Māori and my involvement in, for example, the Vision Mātauranga policy at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. I was the author of that policy. I knew that I could make a contribution to this conversation, but I wanted to take my time. I didn't want to just leap in and react and say all sorts of things, but try and form something constructive. At the same time, too, of course, I have an association with Sir Peter Gluckman here at the University of Auckland, and of course, Peter is one of New Zealand's leading scientists and very significant scientist himself, and we had some really good productive conversations, he and I, about this and that. So my view of the letter was, the key point of the letter was we can't afford a mistrust of science. I felt that was the key message, and I completely agree with that. But unfortunately, that message got a little bit lost in when they started making some comments around Indigenous knowledge and that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I have had a series of conversations now with Kendall Clements, who's one of the authors of the letter. Very good conversations and discussions, and the view that I've come to, and I stress once again, I'm not a scientist and I'm not an epistemologist or philosopher and so on, but the view I came to, actually prompted by Brian Boyd's writing in the Listener, where he said that I draw a sharp line or division between Mātauranga Māori and science. And I responded by saying that I don't draw a sharp line quite as sharply as it was suggested in this letter. And let me explain what I mean. There is lots in Mātauranga Māori that's simply not science. Let's get that out of the way. It's not. There's tons and tons and tons of it. However, there is some dimensions within Mātauranga Māori, which I call its pragmatic dimensions, are at least the seeds of science, if not a kind of science itself. It's not a mature science or a highly developed science such as we understand it to be today, nor could it have been when you consider the history of colonisation. And so I talk about the pragmatic dimensions of Mātauranga Māori through the generations, which is really about hypothesis, testing hypotheses and observation and things like that. They didn't use those words, of course, but the pragmatic dimensions I describe with things like, when our ancestors first arrived here in New Zealand, they had to figure out which plants they could eat, which plants they could harvest for creating clothing or building materials or so on and so forth. They had to figure out how to live in this environment, very much colder climate than they were used to in central Polynesia. We conject that they didn't know what snow or ice was before they arrived here in New Zealand, things like that.
Right. Yeah.
They say so. Even things like Pacific navigation, your theory about how to get across the ocean, you will figure out pretty quickly whether it's going to work or not when you're on the ocean, right? And to the point of life and death and so on. So that's one aspect of this pragmatic dimension. I think the second aspect of this pragmatic dimension is they also began to notice patterns in the natural world, that when the Pūtaiao is in blossom, the mussels are fat, or when this happens, the tuna runs, or this kind of thing. And they started to notice these patterns through time, and they took note of these patterns through time and brought them together into bodies of knowledge, like the maramataka, for example, which is an intergenerationally created body of knowledge, which is guiding you about when to plant or when to fish or how to do this and how to do that according to certain times of the month or times of the year. And this was developed over time. So what I understand you call efficacious knowledge is knowledge that actually works. If you know how to light a fire, for example, and then get the embers from that fire and you put it into the soil, it warms the soil, it provides nutrients as well, it also creates favourable conditions for your kumara to grow. And that, so you learn how to do that, and it's what is called efficacious knowledge or useful knowledge that works and so on. So I argue that there throughout the life of Mātauranga Māori, absolutely, there's a big religious spiritual worldview going on inside of it, and it's got talk about atua and gods and all of this kind of, and it's supernatural powers. Absolutely, Mātauranga Māori's got a ton of that in it. But I also argue there are elements or dimensions within it which I call pragmatic, and I think they're the beginnings or the seeds, at least, of a scientific attitude within the history of Mātauranga Māori, and that is just simply having to figure out pragmatically how to live in the world. I do stress it's not a mature science. It's not a sophisticated science such as what we have today, but as I say, nor could it have been when you consider how its growth was stunted considerably, in the 19th century and the 20th century and that going on. So that's kind of my general view about this more nuanced relationship I see between Mātauranga Māori and science. And the other aspect that I like to talk about is this whole notion of primitivism inside Indigenous cultures. So primitivism became a phenomenon, or the primal mind, the primitive worldview, became very, very influential and powerful in the late 19th and early 20th centuries amongst a group of French sociologists, particularly a man called Lévi-Breuil, who wrote a famous book called How Natives Think. And he...
What year would that have
It's about 1910 or something, thereabouts.
Right. It's interesting.
It's called How Natives Think, and it became extraordinarily powerful construct about primitive cultures versus Western cultures, right? And what he came up with the phrase called mystical participation. And what he said was that primitive man is hopelessly lost in a mystical participation in the phenomena of life, where the world is inhabited by supernatural powers and man is victim to them, right? And so this is classic Lévi-Breuil. Now, of course, there's a good deal of truth in some of that, right? There's a good deal of truth in some of that.
Well, it was the same for the Greeks as well.
So, right. And so the point,
the ancient Greeks.
The point that he makes, though, is because they're lost in this mystical participation, they're incapable of abstract rational thought, right? Which means they're incapable of being able to create anything scientific or begin to engage with the scientific worldview, and they needed Europeans to come along to give them the wherewithal to be initiated into the worldview. The point I'm trying to make here is that humans everywhere at all times have always been abstract, rational, and emotional and spiritual. This is what it is to be human. We're at all times, at all places, everywhere. We're always these things all the time. But it's fair to say that some cultures at different times develop different aspects of their being, right? And so the scientific enterprise grew in certain parts of the world, and it was the discovery of the scientific method and how powerful it became. It wasn't a unique creation of the West. Quite what the advocates in Wellington were saying. It's not a unique creation of the West. Rather, it's something. It's an incredible, powerful insight that came to a number of people in a number of cultures. But of course, it was.
Well, going back to my term, it's science is a mongrel.
Right.
And as I said, mongrels are the best.
It's but I think the reason why I think you might hear Māori voices who are against science or in the today is that science in its powerful modern form came to New Zealand through the institutions of colonisation that were part of the colonial project. So I recently said at a hui in Rotorua, I said, I think our complaint with science is actually not with science itself. Right at the very heart of it, this human quest to know and understand through rational debate and so on, and evidence and all that jazz are gone. This is actually a deeply human thing. I think our complaint is actually with the instruments and vehicles of science, by which what I mean by the power structures that made use of science to perpetuate the colonial project in New Zealand. And I think that's where we have our particular complaint, not so much with the science at its heart itself. Now, of course, Kendall tells me he's made precisely the same comment in various settings and so on, and it hasn't gone down quite as well. But nonetheless,
right, that's interesting. Yeah. So just going back on that, I mean, when I was interviewing, Dan Hikaroa, again on Mātauranga Māori, I said to him, I have much more respect for people who can survive in a pre-scientific and pre-industrial, pre-urbanised environment than I do for you and I,
right.
All of us.
With all of our comforts.
Because if we were put in, if we were transported back in time, we wouldn't last 5 minutes. The enormous amount of knowledge and skill. Rational thinking and working out.
They had to figure it out.
It's phenomenal. Yeah. It's phenomenal. And have you read Steven Pinker's latest book, Rationality?
No.
I haven't either, but it does start. I've heard him talk about it, and it literally starts with a description of African Bushmen, I think. Hunting an armadillo or something like that, and just talks about the completely rational process that they go through and the rational mechanisms that go through to actually successfully hunt this animal. So I think that going back to the French sociologists, I think you were talking about, they are coming from a completely biased 19th century. Right. One could argue they could not come to any other conclusion because it was out anything other than that Europeans were superior.
That's right.
Would be a completely different paradigm, an unknown paradigm.
Absolutely.
So it's not surprising.
Yeah. And so that's another thing that sullies the reputation of science in the eyes of Indigenous peoples. These are so-called scientists coming up, but supposedly neutral, non-biased, actually coming up with theories that happen to serve this superiority thesis.
Yeah. Well, I said, when I interviewed Steven Pinker, I said this to him and he agreed. I said, science is a process of getting most things wrong and some things right.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And, when I interviewed Lawrence Krauss, incredibly renowned physicist, one of the world's sort of most famous physicists, he said most of the things he comes up with are wrong.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so that's the nature of science. It's a bit like evolution,
Yes.
What is it? 99% of all animals that have lived in the world are now extinct. Yes. It's most things, suffer, their veracity over time.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of things do. But the thing that I've come to understand, because this has been a journey for me in learning actually about what science is and how it works, is science is actually our best way to work out which ideas work and which ones don't. And my reading of what the professors were saying was there was actually a genuine attempt to say science is important, we need it to solve all our current problems, as well as solving future problems. We need it for well-being, and we don't want to muddy the waters with things that are non-scientific. Now, we can sort of move on to education, because I'm not sure if many New Zealanders know this, but there's in the latest NCEA document on chemistry and biology, from the Ministry of Education, they're now teaching the concept of, and you correct me on my pronunciation, because every time I say this, people tell me I've got it wrong, the concept of Māori.
Māori.
M-A-U.
Mo, as in Mo Greens?
Māori.
Mo.
Yeah, Mo Greens.
Yeah,
there we go. Māori.
Yeah, Māori.
I can barely speak English properly, so you have to forgive me. Now, do you want to explain what Māori means? And then we can talk about whether you think it should be taught in a scientific context to children.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. So, certainly a feature of Mātauranga Māori, a concept in Mātauranga Māori is this concept called Mauri, which is to do with the animating energy of life. It's to do with the self-generating energy of life. A garden that produces its produce is said to be replete with Mauri. It has animating energy. When a garden is exhausted and is no longer producing produce, it's said that its Mauri has gone. Similarly, it's to do with fertility, fecundity, and things like this. And it was also said traditionally that tohunga, or priests, were able to manipulate Mauri. They were able to harness it and to place it into certain vessels and to enable those vessels to produce produce of various kinds. There's a famous example of what are called the sacred soils of Rangiatea that were brought on the Tainui Waka from central Polynesia. And of course, what I think was going on there was our people, when they left central Polynesia, they made sure they took with them soils they knew they could grow plants in, because they weren't sure, what they were going to be greeted with when they get to the other side. Yeah. So they took soils with them, which they would believe was replete with Mauri, right? It had full of Mauri, meaning it had a life-sustaining capabilities to it. And they brought these soils with them, and they used them in particular gardens and special gardens, and grew their plants in it and so on. So it is said. My own granduncle Māori Marsden, who's a writer on these topics, writes that Mauri is the animating or binding energy of the universe. And it is present in the world and animates the world and sets the conditions by which the creative powers of the world can operate. Trees can grow and ideas can come into the mind and all this kind of stuff. So this Mauri is one of the really key. A key idea inside Mātauranga Māori. Now the question as to whether it ought to be taught in a science class, I don't know, I have to say. I don't know.
Well, my question to you, is it scientific or is it not scientific? So the way I would think of is it scientific or not scientific? If it's scientific, it's taught. If it's not, it's not. Is it not that simple? My last guest, Anthony Paul, who is a very smart professor. He's actually it's actually sort of pertinent to what he studies, because his field of research is the origins of life.
Yeah.
And the clip that I cut out for the opening quote for the podcast was, he was saying there's many cultures, if not all cultures around the world, have come up with a similar concept. He talks about the Japanese, he's half Japanese, he talks about the Japanese having a similar concept, and he's saying as yet there's no evidence to prove that exists. And he was saying that if New Zealand are going to teach it in the science classroom, they better show the world what that evidence is.
Yeah, so the researcher in me, Michael, goes, I haven't investigated this enough, so I'm going to sit on the fence, and I'm going to say...
That is totally legitimate.
Because I haven't really investigated enough to be able to answer the question in a really informed way, in a really constructive way. I I think where you're leading to, someone has said there was a in one of those NCEA things is there's the mode of the macron, not the macron, the mode of the atom or the molecule or something like that. Yeah. Now I think that's going a step way too far. That's going too far because the existing literature that I'm aware of about the concept of mode is reasonably slim and doesn't talk at all about atoms and molecules, or how people didn't even know about such things. Yeah. And I think that's a real big jump to go from kind of some general descriptions of mode that you might find in the writers of Māori Marsden like that, to then say there's mode in an atom or a molecule and so on. For me, the place I would start is, what do we actually mean by mode? What has it got to hold? What is its meaningfulness now to life? How might it be? Does it have any value now going forward? And figure out that, and then approach the question: is this scientific or not? Rather than trying to define mode in the context of a question that says, is this science or not? If you follow what I mean.
Well, maybe what we should do, if you're keen, is we should have another conversation. Maybe not quite so long, but just on this point, because I'd be really interested to get your thinking on it. Because I think it's totally legitimate to say I don't have an answer because I don't know enough about it. But just to sort of finish off on this, here's a quote from this document. Chemistry allows us to predict how substances may alter when the surrounding conditions change, and how they react to form new substances, and how the Māori of the Pūtaiao is affected when this happens. And again, massive apologies for pronunciation.
So I would be uncomfortable with statements like that, because I don't know. I'm not aware of the research that would support such a statement. The relationship between chemistry and how things can change, and then that affects the mode of the forest or the mode of the Pūtaiao or the environment. I'm just not aware of research around that. And what I mean by that is I don't think there is research. That's what I'm saying. That could really support. I think someone's come along and looked at those NCEA materials and started inserting some Mātauranga Māori influenced ideas into those materials. Now, I might be really wrong or really unfair, but I would doubt that there is actually some really substantive research out there which is about figuring out what the place of a concept like mode in chemistry is. You know what I mean? So without knowing the context, I don't know who wrote that. I don't know.
Well, would you be interested in just having another short conversation about that once after a little bit more research?
Perhaps, but maybe I just because I'm not looking for more research to do, Michael, because I've got so much to do already. I'm very happy to have further conversations about things. In due course. Michael, can I I just want to add another comment about science and Mātauranga Māori that I'll be interested to see what you say about this. I very boldly said to a bioprotection symposium the other day that the beginnings of the scientific tradition in New Zealand is actually amongst Māori, in Mātauranga Māori, and that this is something to acknowledge and value and embrace, rather than seeing that science was some kind of thing that came from overseas to serve colonisation only, and therefore has only belonged to to Europeans or to Pākehā and so on. As you can see, what I'm really keen to do is to try and restate the case for an existing Indigenous intellectual tradition that that was present here in pre-European times. It took a form post-European times as well. To not make unjustified assertions about it, but basically to say that any community in the world, you've got thinking, rational people trying to wrestle with the issues of life.
Yeah.
And that was the same with our pre-European ancestors who had to. Yes, they had this spiritual, religious, supernatural worldview. Of course they did, but they also had these pragmatic aspects as well. And this is the beginnings of a you might say of a scientific worldview or a scientific attitude present in the culture in those times, and that this may well turn out to be the beginnings of Aotearoa science, for want of a better term, and then kind of...
Well, I think you have to distinguish two things. So when I interviewed Jerry Cohen, he's a very famous American biologist, he used the term science broadly construed. So he says when the plumber comes to fix your leaking pipe, he's doing science broadly construed. He's not getting tea leaves and looking at the tea, having a cup of tea, looking at the tea leaves, and then comes to the perfect solution. He's using inference and rationality, all those sort of things to come to a conclusion. So he's saying, all people, all humans have a capacity for science broadly construed, and that's we've already talked about that. But then I think you have to distinguish it from modern science, which is an internationally derived set of protocols that has been forming over the last 2,500 years, you could say, from various parts of the globe. And essentially it's our sharpest tool we have. Absolutely, due respect and all that, but we don't turn to Indigenous knowledge to create the COVID vaccine. We turn to literally the sharpest tool in the shed, and to do what we need. And I think that distinction has to be made. And where I see, the education policymakers are getting confused here, they're wanting to incorporate Mātauranga Māori into the education system, but they're going a step too far in a sense, right? I would, and I'm not saying I'm right or anything, but to me it would make much more sense to have a whole course on Mātauranga Māori.
Yeah.
Why, in a sense, why diminish it by putting a smattering? To me, it just smacks of window dressing, and which doesn't serve the education of the science students, and it doesn't serve the Maori culture, because it's to me, it's just sort of shallow. I mean, it's actually, in this case, I would say it's actually wrong, and that's not doing anyone a service.
Yeah.
But that's how I would frame it.
Well, I think that's right. I think that science broadly construed is pretty much what I was saying. Yeah, it's in that similar thing. I do think that the idea of developing knowledge over time and that being tested by others, pragmatic knowledge and that kind of thing. I think that's an aspect of the big, because you're not saying to someone, I've got this piece of knowledge and it works. You're actually saying, I've got this piece of knowledge, you take and go do something with it, and it works. And then that person hands it over, and becomes concretized somewhat into a body of knowledge that that's handed over time. I think that's an aspect of that. When I say those pragmatic dimensions of Mātauranga Māori, and that the great thing about also. I think one last little comment there. The wonderful thing I like about science is humility. The idea that I could be wrong. That's one of the great
and often
we
often are.
And happy to say that. And I think that but the I get the feeling that those people who write about Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous communities think that all Indigenous communities operate on this, the high priest is always right. But I think that's this oversimplification, of what has happened. In some respects, yes, of course, they're the high priests that say that everything's right and things like that. But also, there are lots of examples where a certain high priest has said it's going to be this way, and that turns into conflict. And people go, no, I don't accept that. I'm going to go do something else, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what Stephen Pinker says in the opening of Rationality.
Yeah.
He says it's not, he's describing this situation, and he was saying the young new bucks can challenge the chief.
Yeah.
And say no. What you're like. There's this example of the moon as a stick that flies, something like that, a curved stick that flies across the sky, or something like that, which is just it's mythological, and the young guy is saying no, that's actually not true, to put it politely. I've just pulled up a quote now. The terrible thing is I can't remember where I've got this from, but I think it's pertinent to what we've been talking about here. It says, we're all said to have an inferential, in quotes, black box in our minds. But as Kahneman and Turtsky and others show, it is often prone to inferential malfunction. So we're both saying, yes, all human beings have ability to be rational, but also, as modern research, Daniel Kahneman of Thinking Fast and Slow, there's a whole mishmash of irrationality inside there.
Yeah.
And I think what I find the most beautiful thing about the scientific method is it's able, as best we can, or it's our best tool to actually smooth over those inferential malfunctions that we're prone to. And what my involvement in reading all about this, how I see it is the objectives to either the scientific method or what the seven professors are saying. They're often putting a straw man characterization of science. They often call it Western science, which is actually, it's actually just false. Yeah. And then they the next step they take is that Western science was used as a tool to subjugate Indigenous peoples. In the report, again, I'll link this in the show notes, in the report, education report, sort of a white paper, that the seven professors were reacting to, it actually says it in basically those words. Now, to me, that's not that beneficial if government entities or government consultants or government-sanctioned reports are saying these things, because it's actually, apart from being factually wrong, it's actually very divisive, which I think, that's what I value in what you're saying is your voice is definitely the opposite of that. It's much more rational and more cohesive in your thinking.
Yeah, I've come to my view after a long time with Mātauranga Māori and thinking a great deal about it. First and foremost, I'm a Mātauranga Māori advocate, but I've long said that one must be careful to not make assertions or views about Mātauranga Māori for which you've got no evidence to support it. And I said that in a 2009 lecture I delivered down at the University of Canterbury about it was important to be really clear about the strengths and weaknesses of Mātauranga Māori. I think Mātauranga Māori has got much to offer the cultural life naturally of New Zealand, and its ideas around identity and language and ways in which to articulate ourselves, poetry, arts, all of these kinds of things. It's very strong. Its scientific contribution is not so strong. Let's be really clear about that. It's not so strong, and for all sorts of reasons this is the case.
But there's actually nothing wrong with that.
No.
My scientific contribution to the world is not strong. There's nothing wrong with that.
That's right. But I want to explain why it's not strong, not just make not just say it's not strong. I want to say why this is the case, and why I want to resist notions that science belongs to Pākehā and the arts and humanities owns to Māori. I think that's, it's...
well, that's been my concern about this conversation, is if you want Māori children to become scientists, the best thing to do is to say science is great.
Yeah.
Not to say it's a tool to colonialise Indigenous
but
people.
Also show it's how part of their own history. It's part of their own culture.
Yeah.
It's a part of their own background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sure.
Lawrence Krauss he said he's very much in favour of exactly that.
Yeah, that's right. And to show that rather than this frankly unjustified positioning of science into Western science, therefore it's Pākehā, and Mātauranga Māori is therefore Māori and everything else and all that kind of thing. I think those kinds of massive oversimplifications and frankly unjustifiable kind of characterizations are just not helpful. They don't help our people.
Well, I think that's a beautiful place to end the conversation.
All right.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a great fun. And
it's a bit of a talk all over the show.
No, it's
great.
Good. And I think it's been as I said at the beginning, it's been an honour talking to you, and it's been a real eye opener in terms of learning about your work, and long may it continue.
Kia ora, Michael.